Meanwhile, there's still been a time. So it's
Rabbi, you're live.
Okay, very good. So let's begin. The topic is building sacred spaces. Hope everybody has a Tanakh. And welcome those people listening over the net as well. If you have any questions, you can text them in. See if I can respond. The building sacred spaces. The great builder in the book of Genesis is Jacob. Yaakov is the builder. And there are two separate stories in which the idea of building is very much at the center of Yaakov's experience. The second of which, we'll begin with the second of which, takes place after Yaakov leaves home. He's forced to run away from home. His brother has threatened him. And he also has to leave home to find a wife, sent by his father Yitzchak. So Jacob sets out in the 29th chapter of Genesis on this dual mission with two purposes. And when he comes, he's traveling north. And when he's traveling, he's not exactly sure where he is. But the Torah says that when Jacob is traveling north, he sees, in chapter 29 of Genesis, he sees a well. The Torah says that Jacob saw there was a well in the field. He sees the flocks of sheep there, and there's on top of the well is a rock. So apparently the custom was that the rock was not moved until all the shepherds come, presumably because they want to make sure everybody gets their fair share of water. So Jacob has come to this place. The rock is on top of the well, and he begins to converse with the shepherds, who inform him that Lavan, that's his uncle's daughter, Rachel, is walking towards them. And when Jacob hears this, the Torah says that he rushed forward. He pushes the rock off the well. So the story of Jacob in the land of Haran, as he travels north, begins with Jacob pushing a rock off a well. That's how the story begins. And after Jacob, as we know, ends up marrying not just Rachel, but his sister Leah, and two other women as well. And they have children, and the struggle to have children, and the competition that the Torah described in chapters 29 and 30. And then Jacob runs away, steals away in the night, and his uncle chases after him with his entourage. He catches up with Yaakov, and there's a disagreement, there's a confrontation, at the end of which they make a peace of sorts, and Jacob instructs the people that are with him, his uncle, his people, the people that are with him. Jacob says, "Liktu avonim," gather rocks. And they gather rocks, and they make a pile of rocks, and they eat there together upon the rocks. And Jacob names the rocks Gal-Aid, and Lavan names the rocks the Aramaic Gar-Saduta. So there's a treaty of sorts, but the point about the rocks and the building is that marks the end of Jacob's sojourn in the land of Haran. The rocks essentially form a kind of boundary. Jacob will not cross over, and Laban will not cross over. So Jacob's journey into the north, which begins with one rock, the beginning of the building, which coincides with meeting Rachel, has now concluded, for the most part, with pile of rocks. The family essentially has been built with one exception. Benjamin is not yet born. So Jacob is the builder. That's the story of building that takes place, the physical house, the material house, the family, in chapters 29, 30, and 31 in Genesis. Prior to that, however, the previous chapter is chapter 28, a very well-known chapter. In that chapter, Jacob is running away from home, and he comes to a place. More properly in the Hebrew, Hamakom, the place. And when he comes to the place, he goes to sleep. The Torah says that Jacob, in chapter 28, verse number 11, Vayifka b'makom, he alighted upon the place, and it was getting dark. He decided to go to sleep. Vayikach me'avnei hamakom, he took of the rocks of the place, and he put them under his head. Vayishkav b'makom ahu, he went to sleep in the place. The Hebrew is very interesting. It doesn't say place, it says the place. Somehow he's come to a special place, but apparently he's not aware of that. He goes to sleep, and in this sleep he has a dream. In the dream he sees a staircase or perhaps a ladder to heaven. Angels walk up and down this ladder, a staircase. Above Jacob, God speaks. And God says to Yaakov, God says to Jacob in verse 13, "I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, and the land on which you sleep I will give to you and your descendants. And your descendants will multiply like the dust of the earth in all directions. Through you shall the families of the earth be blessed. And I will be with you, and I will protect you in every place you go. I will bring you back to the land. I will not forsake you until I have done all about which I speak." That's God's speech to Jacob in the place. And when Yaakov wakes up, he's very frightened. He says in verse number 16, "Achen yesh Hashem b'makom hazeh." Certainly God is in this place. V'anochi lo yadati, I didn't know it. V'yirav hayomar manara makom hazeh. How awesome is the place? It is none other, says Jacob, in Beit Elohim, the house of God, and the gateway to heaven, Shara Shamayim. Jacob then gets up in the morning. He takes, it says, the rock that he put under his head. He sets it up as a pillar. He pours oil upon its head. He renames the place Beit El, the house of God, and he takes a vow. In this vow, he says, "If God be with me, if God protect me on the path that I go, if God give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, if I come back in peace to my father's house, then God, Hashem, will be for me a God. And this rock, which I have set up as a pillar, shall become the house of God. All that you give me, I will tithe." So the question is, in this story, which obviously is one of the central stories of Genesis, what exactly is Jacob saying? What is Jacob's vow? Let me begin by pointing out that in this story, God says to Jacob, "I will protect you. I will bring you back home. Shmarani, Hashivoticha, I will not forsake you." And it's interesting because before Jacob leaves, his mother, Rebecca, says to him, "You have to go away for if your brother's angry at you, it's going to cool off in a little while. Go away for a few days. I will call you back. I will bring you home." So Jacob sets out, presumably thinking he's away for a week or two or a month or whatever, maybe a little bit more. He's got to meet the daughters of his uncle. He's got to marry one of them. And then God says to Jacob, "I will protect you. I will not abandon you. I will bring you back home." When somebody says, "I will protect you," that's when you start worrying. Protect me from what? I'm going to see my uncle for a couple. Why do I need protection? And in point of fact, at this point we realize he's not going away for a day or two or a week. He's going to a place, in the words of the Torah, the land of the east. In Genesis, when you go eastward, you never come back. So he's going to a place which nobody has ever returned, and there is unspecified danger. And as he is leaving the sacred land, as he's leaving the land of Canaan, he chances upon the place, Hamakom. It's interesting because the expression "the place" appears in one other place in the book of Genesis. Appears 4 times there. The place. That's the story of the binding of Isaac. In the binding of Isaac, the Torah emphasizes that Abraham comes to the place. But that's a story that takes place at the end of Abraham's life. That's, in a way, the end of his search, the end of his journey. But when it comes to Jacob, it happens at the beginning of his journey. And not only that, with Abraham, the Torah emphasizes that he sees from a distance, he sees behind him, he perceives. He understands at that moment what his obligations are, who he is, what is the mission. But when Jacob, he chances upon the place, and he has no idea. He says himself, "I didn't know. I didn't realize where I was." So the mission of Jacob is not to discover the place. He discovers it by accident. The mission of Jacob, actually, is to come back. The story of Jacob is the person who has to return, and very often returning is much more difficult than discovering. And return to do what? Now, there are two ways to read Jacob's vow in chapter 28. If you be with me, if you feed me, if you call me, you'll be my God. What does that mean? If you don't feed me and don't call me, you will not be my God. It's possible that Jacob is negotiating. But it's also possible to read it a different way, and I think actually a preferable way, and that is what our patriarch Yaakov is saying is this. You address me as the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, the God of my ancestors. But Jacob says, that if you protect me and be with me, you'll be my God. And by that, Jacob means that I will fulfill a particular mission that only I can do. And the mission that Jacob sets out for himself in his own words is to build the house of God. Beit Elohim, God's house. Now the question is, what does it mean, God's house? House actually in the Bible has many meanings. It can mean a physical house. It can mean a dynasty. It can mean a family. In the case of Jacob, among other things, I believe it means a family which everybody is included. The story of Genesis is about, before Jacob, is about choosing one covenantal heir. Abraham is one of 3 sons who's chosen. Isaac is one of 2 sons who was chosen covenantally. Ishmael has a blessing, but not the covenantal blessing. Esau is one of 2 sons, but Jacob has the covenantal blessing of Abraham. And now Jacob says, as he's leaving home, if you be with me, if you protect me, if you bring me back in peace, then I will make a different contribution. I will build the house of God. I will have a structure, a family, in which every member of the family, at least every son in this patriarchal book, is fully included. That's Jacob's mission, and Jacob succeeds, because at the end of this book, the end of Genesis, he blesses all the sons. They don't all have the same blessing. Some might say have the superior blessings. The first 3 sons have not just the blessing, but essentially a critique. But the important point is, critique or not, they're all part of the family. Ela b'nei Yaakov, Shnei Masar, these are the 12 sons of Jacob, they're all included. So Jacob actually succeeds in the mission of building the house. That's on one level. And on another level, the word bayit over here refers specifically to a space. Jacob says, when he wakes up from his dream, Jacob says, this is none other than Beit Elohim, the house of God, and the gateway to heaven. What does Jacob mean when he says, this is the house of God? Well, what does it mean? What is he referring to, this is the house of God? He's not referring to the place that he's sleeping, that's for sure. Because at the end of the story, Jacob says, if you be with me and protect me, I will build the house of God. So he's not referring to the house of God in the beginning of the story. In fact, he calls the place where you're sleeping Shara Shamayim, the gate, the gateway to heaven. What he's saying is something else. He's saying the place where I am sleeping, above, not here, the place above me is the house of God. God's house is up there. If you protect me and care for me, says Jacob, I will build the house of God down here. And that's something that the psalmist is worthy of the house of God. Could be, but I don't think so, because I think in the story that's the point of this bridge, of this ladder. The point of the ladder is to connect. Well, let me explain it better. The point of the ladder is to connect God's house down here. In short, what Jacob says is very simply, I will build God's kingdom on earth, what Jacob says. And God's kingdom on earth, the great chain of being, earthly Jerusalem, is exactly opposite heavenly Jerusalem. In order to clarify this and make it much more obvious, there's another story in Genesis which is related to Jacob's story here in chapter 28. And that's the story which has immense significance, because biblical narrative stories play off each other. So the foundational stories of Genesis keep reappearing throughout the Bible. And one of them, the Tower of Babel, Migdal Babel, Tower of Babel. In that story, Torah says in chapter 11 of Genesis, the world gathers in one place. They are of one speech, of one tongue. Sfarim Achadim Safa Achat, and they gather together does the world, and they say, let us build a city and a tower, Umigdal, to Rosho Bashamayim, the top of which is in the heavens. Now Kasuto has pointed out that in the story of the Tower of Babel, the Torah says the place was called Babel because the people were babbling on. The people couldn't understand the language each one couldn't understand the other one's language because God confused the language. Kasuto points out that that can't possibly be the real reason for Babel. Who would name the city Babel? But rather, Kasuto points out, what I think is intuitively obvious, that Babel means something different. It means Bav El. Bav, of course, Bava is a gate. They called their city the gateway to heaven. That's Bavel. Their gateway to heaven, though, their conception of the gateway to heaven was Migdal V'Roshel B'Shamayim. The top of their tower was in heaven. And God resents this in the Torah because the human being can't be in heaven. The human being can only be on earth. And therefore, God disperses them. The correct gateway to heaven is Jacob's ladder, which connects heaven and earth. The heavens belong to God. But Jacob says, but I will build your temple, as it were. I will build your sacred space here on earth. And the prototype for the sacred space on earth is the space up in heaven. They're exactly mechuvan, as it says. They're actually opposite. They face each other. One's below the other. They're linked by this staircase or ladder. The angels go up and down, connecting the two. But our mission, says Jacob, our mission is to build the inclusive structure, the temple, the sacred space here on earth, which is exactly below the sacred space up there. Not Migdal V'Rosho B'Shamayim, not a tower who's the top of which the Rosh is in heaven, but rather Ulam Mutzav Artzav V'Rosho Magia HaShamayim. The connection is to heaven, yes, but when Jacob wakes up, he takes the rock which he had placed in the Rasho Tav under his head. The Torah plays with the word Rosh. At the end of it, he takes this pillar, by Yitzok Shemin al Rosha, on top of the pillar he pours, on top of its head, as it were, he pours the anointing oil, and the promise to return, and the promise to do what he can do, not just as part of a tradition, but as part of my own special mission. Vayah Hashem li Elokim, God will be my God, in the sense I have my own particular. That's Jacob's mission. That's Jacob's vow. The problem is that in building this inclusive structure of the Bayit, he faces a great enemy who tries to prevent him from doing it. And the enemy, of course, who appears prominently in the next 3 chapters. Yes, Lavan is a bad guy, but he's not the real enemy. The real enemy, the real obstacle to Jacob building the inclusive structure is Jacob himself. Jacob, the human being with his loves and his concerns, his favoritism. The house is built, the house of Jacob is built from the competition. The house is built through people trading with each other. The house is built through deception. And Jacob is part of all that. So what Yaakov has to learn how to do is somehow to make his dream come true by somehow overcoming obstacles that, for the most part, he puts in his own way. That's Jacob's mission. That's the Beit Elohim. That's the challenge of Breshit. That's the challenge of Jacob. And it's a challenge that he meets very well, ultimately, with some help. He gets help. One of the pivotal figures in Genesis, for those who have studied the book, we've all studied it again, is Judah. Takes responsibility for the family, and somehow, some way, he's able to meet his goal of establishing a family which everybody counts, everybody's included. At least the sons are included in the patriarchal book. That's the builder of Genesis. That's Jacob of the book of Genesis. Now we have the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus begins with the first verse. These are the sons of Jacob who came down to Egypt. These are the sons. These are their names. That's how the book begins, the book of names. Everybody had a name. Ishu Beito Bo, they came down with the house. That's how the book begins. They came down with a bayit. They came down with a house. And something happens in the beginning of the book of Exodus and the name is somehow lost. The name gets lost. The name means the identity. The identity gets lost in the beginning of the book of Exodus. When you come to the second chapter of Exodus and you begin to read it, nobody has a name. A man from the house of Levi marries a woman from the house of Levi. They have a child. And there's a mother and there's a sister. We know the names later. When you read chapter 2 of Exodus, what is striking is the loss of name. How do we account for the loss of name? They came down with names. Somehow they lost their name. And there are, I think, several different ways to account for the loss of name, the loss of identity in the beginning of the book of Exodus. The most obvious reason is that they are enslaved. The slave loses the name because the slave is not actually a person. The slave is an object. So there's no name. If there's no name, then there's no house either. The house, the community consists at the end of the day of a set of individuals. It's not homogeneous. A good community is not homogeneous. Everybody brings different things to the community, bring their own identity. And from these identities, we find a way, hopefully, not just to live together, but to build together. But the book of Exodus, the book of names, these other names, begins with the loss of name. There are other factors as well. It's not just the slavery. It's not just the enslavement. It's not just the persecution. There are other factors as well with the loss of identity. But for our purposes, let's start with the slavery. So what about the slavery? What about the slavery that we find in the beginning of the book of Exodus? What does the Torah say about the slavery? So let's just take a look for one moment at chapter 1 of Exodus. Torah says that, first it gives us the names. And then it says that a new king emerged from the land of Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people in the first chapter of Exodus, "Behold, the children of Israel have become many. We have to outsmart them, lest they multiply and join up with the enemy and spring up from the earth." So he placed upon them taskmasters to oppress them in their hard labors, and they built store cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. Even as he oppressed them, they continued to grow, to multiply. And the next two verses say, the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites, the Parech. Parech, what does Parech mean? This translation says, ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites. Some interpret Parech, crushing labor. Interesting is actually the Midrash. The Midrash says an interesting thing about Perech. What kind of labor did he impose upon the Israelites? So one of the Midrashim says he gave the men women's work and the women men's work. Now, what is the Midrash saying? The Midrash is saying that it's not actually how difficult the labor is. He gave them work that in that society was considered inappropriate for that person, or perhaps somebody could do it better. He gave them work they're not accustomed to, not to teach them the trade, but to frustrate them. And what's very interesting is, I don't know if the Midrash knew this or not, for the last 50 or so years, through our discovery of many ancient Near Eastern texts, we have come across something called pirchu. In the ancient Near East, pirchu was the prohibition to give a free person slave labor and to give a slave free person labor. It's forbidden to do that. And what's interesting, the Midrash essentially is saying the same thing in a different language. It's making a very important point, that the Pharaoh's motive over here was to frustrate. In fact, if I were a boss and I had people working in my factory and I wanted to produce more, I would certainly give them work they could do. I might make it more hours. I wouldn't give them vacations. But I would not give them work they could not do well. You want to give people the work they can do well so they can produce better. But the Midrash says, Perech. Now, where is this Midrash coming from? The Midrash is seeing something in the text, actually. But not necessarily this text. The Midrash is seeing something in a different text, a related text. And that is a story that appears 4 chapters later when Moses goes to Pharaoh. God has spoken to Moses. Moses has reluctantly accepted his mission to free the slaves, to bring them to the good land, to the promised land. And Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, listen, we have a request from you in chapter 5 of Exodus. We want to go out a 3-day journey into the desert to serve our God. God has come up, spoken to us, and our God has demanded that we should serve God for. So we have to go out into the desert. We can't serve God in Egypt. The Egyptians will resent it. Let us travel a 3 days journey into the desert. So Pharaoh does not take kindly to the request. And Pharaoh says, no, that's not going to happen. There are too many of you. I can't afford it. I can't allow them to cease from labor, he says in chapter 5. And not only that, after Moses walks out, he says to his workers, he says to his taskmasters, up to this point we gave them straw. From this point on, and from the straw they make the bricks. So he says, from now on, let them find their own straw, but the quota remains the same. They have to produce the same number of bricks, but we're not going to give them the straw. So they start to forage around to find straw. Of course, that takes time. Torah says they can't produce the same number of bricks. So the Hebrew taskmasters are beaten by the Egyptian taskmasters. The people can't do what they're supposed to do. Everybody's resentful. And the question, I think, is, if you're Pharaoh, why would you do this? I mean, if I were Pharaoh, I would say, what is the quota? 15 bricks an hour. Make it 20. That makes sense. Because I get more work out of the people. They're working harder. I'm sending a message. At the end of the day, we're building the cities. Arei Miskanot, the store cities, and now we have more bricks. That's not what Pharaoh does. Pharaoh doesn't have them produce more bricks. In point of fact, he has them produce less bricks. So what is the thinking? So I think the conclusion is clear. He doesn't care about the building. It's not that he makes them work hard because he wants to build something. He has zero interest in the building. That's what the Torah says. He wants to crush them. He wants inui. He wants to oppress them. The labor is a means to oppress them. But the building per se is no interest to Pharaoh. That's what the Midrash is picking up. Perech. He doesn't really care about the building. The building is purposeless from his standpoint. The building is to keep them, it's busy work, to keep them working. And the more frustrating, the better. To frustrate and to break them down. That's how the book of Exodus begins. That's the work. That's the avoda. That's the slavery beginning of the book of Exodus. The truth of the matter is, most people do not mind working hard. There's a purpose. When it's purposeless, we all resent that. That's the avoda. So in terms of reflecting now upon the work in the beginning of the building, in the beginning of the book of Exodus, let's just consider for a moment what this building is about. It is called avoda, from the word eved. Now the word avodah can mean work. The word avodah can mean slavery. It's hard to know which one it is sometimes. Sometimes it's a fine line. But in the case of Pharaoh, one element of slavery as opposed to work, I would say there were several elements that distinguish slavery from work. One is that you can't quit in the middle. You can't stop. They're on vacations. When Moses asks for a vacation to serve God, he gets a negative. Can't stop. Number two, you're not paid for your labor. You do it. It's not voluntary labor. It's coerced, and there's no payment. Beyond that, the slave has a certain social status. The slave is reduced to something less than fully human. In fact, in thinking about this idea of work as opposed to slavery, another story comes to mind that I referenced before. And the story is when Jacob runs away from his uncle. Jacob steals away at night, or steals away at some point, and he leaves without telling his father-in-law, uncle, that he's leaving. He takes the possessions he has garnered, he runs away. And in chapter 31 of Genesis, Lavan chases after him, catches him, and they have a strong disagreement. Why did you steal away? Why did you steal my daughters with you? Why did you steal my gods? Because Rachel's taken his idols. And Jacob says, I didn't steal anything, but if you want to go check, go check. So Lavan actually rummages through all of Jacob's tents, that's the wives' tents, Can't find anything because Rachel has hidden the idols. And then when he walks out, Jacob gets angry. First time in 20 years, he gets angry at Lavan. So what have I done wrong? I worked so diligently for you, he says. Avadaticha. Avadaticha, I did avodah. Does he mean slavery or does he mean work? It means slavery. Because, he can't leave. When he runs away, when he quits, his boss chases after him. And he says to Lavan, you've changed my wages on 10 different occasions. So I wasn't paid fairly for my work. Slave is not paid. But above everything else, what sets Yaakov off in that story is the fact that Lavan into his houses, into his tents, into the private domains of Jacob. Because from Lavan's standpoint, as he actually says, it's all mine. I says Lavan, own you. Privacy and dignity are deeply connected. So the slave has no privacy. Because the slave has no dignity. The slave's not a person. What Jacob understands at the end of 20 years is that this is not my place. This is not for me. I thought I was a worker. I thought I was a son-in-law. No, I'm a slave. I'm a non-person in the story. And Jacob separates from Laban. He builds the rocks, sets the boundaries. He goes on. He reflects back later on his experience in Lavan Garti. I was a stranger in that place. Jacob reinterprets his own past. And then he sets out, of course, to return to the sacred place he has promised to return to. So the book of Exodus begins in similar fashion in describing work imposed upon the Israelites by the Pharaoh, or avodah, which is deeply connected to the inui, to the suffering, and it's slavery. You can't leave, you're not paid, and you're not a person. And the work has no meaning. That's the beginning of the book of Exodus. Now, what is the end of the book of Exodus? That's one side of it. What is the other side? How does the book of Exodus actually end? It's an interesting book. It ends with building the tabernacle. It ends with the Mishkan. And not just ends with the Mishkan. The book of Exodus, 40 chapters. At least 12 of them deal with building the Mishkan. It's not just that it ends. The Mishkan is a central motif and also a concluding section of the book of Exodus. If it's the concluding section of the book of Exodus, it's the other side of the end, other side of the structure. It's telling us something about what has to happen when we leave Egypt. Now, this journey. Book ends with the tabernacle. Book ends with sacred space. Now, what is unique, what is special about the space that is built in the book of Exodus? What are the defining characteristics of this sacred space? So let's see. Yes, please speak up.
It's inclusive, it's participatory.
Okay, so first of all, it is, I would say, inclusive, yes, and I would go even beyond that. The Mishkan was built essentially with donations. The key word in the Mishkan, in fact, the builders of the Mishkan, there is an architect, the main architect, named Bezalel. He has his helpers. He has the wise men and women who have particular skills and gifts. But fundamentally, when the Torah speaks about building the Mishkan, there's an expression that appears more than one time. Kol nediv lev. Nediv lev. Nidava. The gifts are called nidava, which means voluntary offerings. The Mishkan is not built in a coercive fashion. The Mishkan was built with voluntary gifts. And it's interesting that the Torah says something happened in that Mishkan that probably never happened again in human history. I'm sure it never happened. Anybody involved in fundraising knows this. That in the Mishkan, actually, Moses has to issue a clarion call, kol b'machaneh, to stop giving. They're giving too much. Hey, mevim nidava od baboker, they gave too much. People were asked to give voluntarily, and everybody rose to the moment. Everybody accepted the challenge. So they had too much. Too much. So it's built with voluntary offerings. It's very interesting as a small digression in terms of the voluntary nature of building the Mishkan. What's interesting is that within our canon, within our Bible, we have two different books of the Bible that deal extensively with building the tabernacle. Not the tabernacle, the temple. The temple is a sort of permanent tabernacle. One is the Book of Kings. The great builder was Solomon. Shlomo is the builder of the temple. And the other book that deals extensively, even more so with the temple as a central feature of the book, is the book of Divrei Hayamim, the book of Chronicles. When you read these two books, which give two different accounts, radically different accounts of the role of David and Solomon, you notice something very interesting about the two books. The book of Kings, when it talks about Solomon building the temple, it spends several chapters describing Solomon's temple. The emphasis in the book of Kings is that the work was done, the work was coerced. The people did not have a choice. That Solomon actually conscripted people to build the temple, and the language of it is very striking. Many of the words that we have in the word Sevel, for example, appears over there. The word Rodim, a Rodim Ba'am appears over there. Term Arei Miskenot appears elsewhere. In other words, it's not would appear in the book of Kings that it's not a voluntary building, that actually Solomon forces the people to build the temple. And in fact, even before you get to the temple, the first verse that describes Solomon after he ascends the throne is a very shocking verse. Vayitchaten Shlomo et bat Paro melech Mitzrayim. It's the first verse. He marries Pharaoh's daughter. One might say that the building of the temple in the book of Kings at least has elements of the kind of building that we find in the beginning of the book of Exodus. That is to say, it's not voluntary. It's coerced, it's forced upon the people. When you come to the book of Chronicles, it's very striking. When you study the book of Chronicles, many people don't study the book of Chronicles. It's worthwhile reading it in conjunction with Kings and Samuel. There, the key word is nadav. The word is voluntary. In fact, the first voluntary gift to the temple was made by, you know who? David himself. King David actually gives a big nadav, big gift. Before he dies, he gives a big gift to the temple that in the version of Chronicles he's putting together with Solomon. So it looks like the chronicler actually was disturbed by the description of the building in Kings, and the chronicler takes us to a different place, where the temple of Solomon, David's temple, and Solomon's temple, the other version, has a voluntary giving, voluntary offering, which of course in the Mishkan is very central, the word nadav. Now what else besides the fact that it's, yes, participatory, voluntary, inclusive, and what else do we have? The language is very interesting about, there's at least two other interesting features, the building of the temple in the book of Exodus that directly contrast with the building of the temple, or the building of the so-called store cities for Pharaoh. What else do we have there? Well, first of all, the word that describes the building. The word that is used predominantly when it comes to the building of the temple, of the sanctuary, of the Mishkan, is the word milacha. Not the word avodah. The word avodah appears a few times. It's interesting to study when it does appear, when it doesn't appear. But the predominant word is the word milacha, which of course is this very same word that's used to describe the way God builds the world. God rested mikol melachto asher asa, kivo shavat mikol melachto, the triple use of the word milacha. So one might say that the human building, perhaps related to the word malach, which is the messenger, that we are imitating, as it were, God's building. God builds the world in Genesis chapter 1, 7 days, 6 plus 1, and the human building of God's sacred space, the earthly temple, is melacha. It's the human being imitating what God does. There's something even more interesting than that about not just the voluntary nature and not just melacha. It's very, yes. Yes, that's very correct. That's an important point. That's an excellent point. People do what they're skilled at. The Torah emphasizes that the men and women, actually, in that case, it's one of the few places where the women are really fully participating there. And the idea of inclusiveness, but particularly the ones who had a particular skill could use their skill. It's exactly the opposite of how the Midrash reads, Avodah Kasha, Perech. And it's bringing out the best in people using their particular gifts, whether it's their physical gifts, whether it's their vision. In the case of Jacob, it was his vision He imagines a different kind of world. He imagines a kind of inclusive family that never existed before Jacob. That's a very important point. What else? What else? I would say that, connected to your point, is something else, since you mentioned that. What's interesting is that the Talmud, of course, the whole rabbinic tradition, sees the tabernacle building as the model for work which is prohibited on the Sabbath. And what's interesting is, in particular, they picked up on an expression that we find in the building of the tabernacle at the end of the book of Exodus. Very striking expression. Mulechet machshevet. Mulechet, purposeful labor. What is for the Sabbath, says the Talmud, is only purposeful work. Destructive work is, from the Torah standpoint, not actually forbidden. It's called the kalke. Not forbidden. It's mulechet machshevet, purposeful labor, which is exactly to the point you make. And that is work with a purpose, work with a meaning. People looking for meaning. People looking for work with meaning. It's very important. Now there's something else which is very significant in the Torah's description of the Mishkan. Exactly the opposite of Pharaoh, which is what? Go ahead, speak up.
I have the sense of Mitzvah, this was following the command, I suppose, but everything else was going on. Somehow or other, I feel like in this description, we're kind of missing that the whole thing was God's plan. That, what the Pharaoh did, what he did, and he was frustrated. All those things.
Let me see if I can slightly reformulate what you're saying. You're making a very important point, actually. The Torah describes the tabernacle building, the term that appears over and over and over again, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe, must be 15, 20 times, as God commanded. On the other hand, what is curious about the Mishkan is that from one perspective, we are doing what we are commanded to do. From a different perspective, the emphasis in the Torah is on two things. First of all, on the particular skills people have, what they call chachma, and various kinds of skill, in terms of working with different woods and metals and all that. But there's actually something else extremely interesting when the Torah describes the building of the Mishkan, and that is that the Torah emphasizes that you ought to do, God says to Moses, not just what I tell you to do, but you ought to do what you saw. Several places, kasher atom moreh bahar, kasher eit bahar. But what is the idea of doing what you see? I have a good friend in Israel. Sometimes we teach together. He's sometimes very visual person. He's an artist. And he says to me, what actually happened was God took Moses up to the heavens, and God shows Moses God's temple. There's a temple up there. That's what Jacob said. There's a temple up there. And God says to Moses, takes him around like a dozen or something. This is what you got to build down there. Whatever I showed you. But the idea of showing, I think, has another significance, which is there's room for artistic expression. Yes, you're correct. It's exactly what God is commanding. But there's also room for artistic expression. I think more broadly, that's a very important point. Because to figure out what is our mission, that's very important. We're trying to figure out what is our mission. It would be folly for me to try to figure out what is your mission. How would I know? That would just be arrogance. Let's figure out our own mission, but everybody has a different mission. So there's something about, yes, we are commanded beings. That is, we are commanded to do God's work in this world. But the form that it takes, who knows? Everybody's got to figure that out. I had something else in mind. Yes, Vicky.
If God says to make what we saw, that's not, is that not to say the expression, we're just copying not Judas?
It's never just copying, because I think you can't just copy it. First of all, two people want to see the same thing. Let's start with that. Everybody has a different perception. That's where the art comes in. Two people can draw a vase, it's not the same vase. It's the same vase there, but they're expressing it differently. So I suppose it depends on how one sees the artistry over here. But my point is, there are two different things that are happening. The commandedness is very important. A commanded being, that's very central. But I do believe in the Mishkan, it's an interesting model for us, because there the Torah seems to be emphasizing individual gifts, individual creativity. Yes?
I'm not sure if you can see it in the verses, but certainly you get it. There's a message like Tantra Nietzsche, I don't think your ultimate salvation comes through work. Because even though you're building this, you should still rest on the Sabbath.
Of course, that's the next point I was going to make. Yes.
Just contrast.
That's a very important point. Of course. The point is a very simple point. Point is that the Mishkan, both in the instruction to build and the building, adjoins the Mishkan with the Shabbat. Which means, this is a very important point, this is the most important thing I'll say. First of all, it's the opposite of Pharaoh. Because what Pharaoh said when Moses says we want to serve God, what he says, V'ishbatem, you would cause them to have Shabbat? That's his language. There's no Sabbath. Now for Pharaoh, he doesn't want a Sabbath for a different reason. Because the moment you stop working, you begin to think, that's very dangerous. That's when we get in trouble, or not. We can be in a place for 20 years and hate it, but we never leave it. So one day we leave it, for 2 days, for 3 days, for a week. What am I doing here? You look back at it. Shabbat allows you to evaluate the week. But there's a different point, and I wanted to end with this point about building sacred spaces, or any institution for that matter. The work itself is not what's significant. In fact, the institution itself isn't even significant. Because the point of the Torah is it's connected to something higher. It should be. In the case of the Mishkan, it's connected to the Sabbath. It's connected to God's work. That's what the Sabbath is. It's God's mulacha. So it's a way to remind ourselves that our work in this world should be modeled upon God's work. That's what Jacob said. When Jacob had the vision, he saw God standing above the staircase. He saw the heavenly temple. He said, the heavenly temple is there. Human beings can't be in the heavenly temple. Because we're not God. We're just human. That was the folly of Babel, to think we can ascend to heaven. We can't ascend to heaven. We're in this world. But our goal is to take what we understand of the other world, of the other place, of this holy space up there, and to build God's house down here. And that work, which is modeled upon sacred space up there, whether it's the Mishkan, whether it's the values that we hold dear, whether it's God's creation of Shabbat, or resting on Shabbat, that, says the Torah, is what work should be about. Our work should be meaningful, purposeful work, inclusive work, and work that takes us to a different place. At the end of the day, the Mishkan in the Torah has one main purpose. One purpose is to serve God, but that's not its main purpose. The main purpose in the Torah for the Mishkan is what Nachmanides taught us. It's a place from which God continues to speak. That's very important. The story is not over. The story doesn't end at Sinai, says the book of Exodus. God continues to speak. We should all be blessed in participating in building spaces that reflect our values. So many times it happens, we build institutions and we think the institution is an end in itself. It's kind of idolatry, actually. It's not an end in itself. It's good if it moves us forward and if it connects us to sacred places and impels us to move forward and reminds all of us that there's an ongoing message and an ongoing mission. And yes, we are commanded. That's true. But we also have to figure out, as Jacob figured out, what is my particular mission? What is my particular contribution? And we thank you for participating.